Now, today's announcement follows an earlier bill that was introduced this week, one that would make it easier for Albertans to trigger a referendum, which the opposition Alberta NDP says flirts with provincial separatists. Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Stevie O'Brien, Liberal strategist working at Macmillan, Cole Hogan, Conservative strategist and principal at GT, and George Soule, former Director of Communications for the NDP. Hello to all three of you.
Hello.
Hello.
So, I'll add to a little bit of what we heard from Danielle Smith there, because she also goes on to say that Albertans are frustrated with the re-election of the Liberal Party, the Liberal government. So it makes me wonder, how should Mark Carney, Stevie, how should he respond to the Alberta Premier? Because essentially we've had two shots across the bow this week alone.
So I think Carney does have to take steps to build the Team Canada that he promised during the election. He's got a lot of ambitious plans that require cooperation from coast to coast to coast. And I think he's going to have to treat this relationship with respect as requested, but there's been no indication that he would do otherwise. And I think that the anger we saw in that clip is maybe a little bit unjustified when it comes to Prime Minister Carney specifically, but is more reflective of the sort of broader anger around carbon pricing, carbon tax, and maybe Alberta's place in the Federation. Yeah,
and to that, the first thing Mark Carney did as Prime Minister was to get rid of the carbon tax. How do you think he needs to respond to a very aggressive stance from the Alberta Premier, Cole?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to see Mark Carney take a different approach to Western Canada than we saw Justin Trudeau, Wilkinson, Guilbeault take in terms of, oil and gas projects, environmental policy. I think Danielle Smith and a lot of Conservatives in the West who are upset with watching Carney and another Liberal government get elected, some of the grievances they have are over stuff like Bill C-69. They want to see more energy projects go through and not be rejected. So that'll be a bit of the difference that's, that Mark Carney has to play in order to make some gains. And I think we'll see, my cousin Corey Hogan, newly elected in Calgary Confederation. I think we'll see him play
the Liberals.
For the Liberals, I'll have to add. We'll see him. I think play a significant role in these conversations, trying to change the tune in Western Canada. And I think in terms of the Western separatism stuff, I have to agree with Jason Kenney that I don't think it's a serious enterprise, and it's always been a fringe movement.
Yeah, George, what do you make of this? Because Mark Carney was just re-elected, Monday night, and on Tuesday we get a shot across the bow from the Alberta Premier. Thursday we get a shot across the bow from the Alberta Premier. How should Mark Carney be responding to this?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I mean, I'll get to the part where I think Mark Carney has to take it seriously in a second, but also I think you have to recognize that Danielle Smith is dealing with a whole lot of controversies on her own. She's dealing with stuff within her own cabinet, people having to leave, people maybe being forced out, documents leaked. It's a mess in her government right now. And, if I will say that there's quite a strong opposition that's holding her feet to the fire on that. So as long as she can keep the focus on Ottawa and Liberals, then that helps people kind of come to her side in Alberta. And make no mistake, Danielle Smith, you can say what you want about her, but she's a very talented communicator. And so that tone that you heard today, that again, suggesting that the Prime Minister needs to work with her, well, basically yelling at him, that's intentional, right? She's speaking to the home crowd, but I'm sure that behind closed doors she would actually welcome a meeting. And I do think that Mark Carney does need to take it seriously, not just for politics, but for the whole country. Again, the idea that we do need to face down Donald Trump and we need to do that together. I think he needs to take that seriously. And so they need to find a way to kind of go around the drama that she's creating to protect her own skin, to actually have conversations to move forward, to actually help Canadians.
Okay, but whatever the motivation is, without a doubt, Mark Carney immediately faces two big challenges, one in Donald Trump, another with Danielle Smith. The success or failure of how he handles that, Stevie, what will that say about the longevity of this government?
So I think it's more than just those two. I think what this election showed was a lot of divisions. It was still relatively close. We saw divisions between East and West, as we just talked about, but also between young and old, men and women, rural, urban. So we are a country that needs to be united to face the threat from tariffs and Trump. But we have a lot of divisions that we need to find ways to either heal or bridge and come together as a real Team Canada.
And do you think Mark Carney can do that?
I certainly do, but it will be difficult.
Yeah, what would you add to that, Cole, or disagree with that?
Sure. I agree in terms of the dividing lines for the election. All of those things are true. I think this election was primarily about two things. It was about who's best to deal with Donald Trump and the cost of living. And the Liberals and Mark Carney were able to convince enough Canadians that he's the person for this job. So I think his success is contingent on his success with Donald Trump. Mark Carney also said during the election that he was going to, push forward, make Canada an energy superpower. And I think, in terms of making Canada more self-sufficient and relying on ourselves and less on the states, I hope he's successful in that regard.
Mm-hmm. George, what would you say?
Yeah, and I think the other advantage that Mark Carney has is, I say this respectfully, but there wasn't that big a huge difference between the platforms. The way they were spun for sure, but the actual plans and commitments in the platform of the Conservative Party and that of Mr. Carney and the Liberals were quite close together. So, if he can find ways to then sit down and say where can those two parties at least agree, I think that's going to help in the West a lot. But I think also there are a whole lot of progressives, too many, a whole lot of progressives who lent their vote to the Liberals, and in expectation for the Liberal Party to be what they've seen in the last 10 years. And so I think on the flip side of this national unity thing, as far as maintaining some support across the country, it's going to be hard for him to balance that, the kind of center-right, maybe even right, Liberal that he is versus the kind of expectation that folks have from the Justin Trudeau years in the last decade.
Yeah, it's something to watch, which, I'll get to that in a second, but of course not just Mark Carney who has challenges right now. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, also has challenges. He leads the Conservatives into its highest vote count since the Mulroney days, yet loses his own seat. And then, in the aftermath of the election, it's completely exposed just how poorly he gets along with some provincial Conservatives. Take a listen to what we heard from two Conservative premiers.
Last time I checked, Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election. Matter of fact, him or one of his lieutenants told every one of his members, "Don't you dare go out and help the PCs."
I didn't have a relationship with him. I don't have a relationship with him. Obviously, during our campaign, there was a situation. I think the Globe story was pretty accurate. It's something that happened there that kind of probably had ramifications on both sides.
Okay, so the premiers of Ontario and Nova Scotia, both Conservatives, essentially having their criticisms of Pierre Poilievre. I'll begin with you here, Cole, because Conservatives did well in the polls. In fact, in a normal election, it would have delivered them a majority government. However, when Canadians were asked who was their preference for Prime Minister, it was always Mark Carney. Pierre Poilievre underperformed the party. He cannot win his own seat. Does he stay on as leader? Should he stay on as leader?
I think he has the support to stay on as leader, and I'll tell you why. You pointed to the fact that Pierre Poilievre was able to gain the most support for a Conservative Party since 1988 under Brian Mulroney. We saw some significant gains, BC, Alberta, mostly in Ontario, Southern Ontario, and encroaching onto Liberal territory in the GTA. So there's some numbers there that point to a voter coalition that Pierre Poilievre has been able to grow over the years. He brought a lot of these people into the party in 2022, and he grew the voter coalition since then. But it's clear that some things are going to have to change, right? It's incumbent on every political leader and party after a loss to take a look at what worked, what didn't, what went right, what went wrong, and move forward accordingly. I think we've seen a lot of senior Conservatives come out and say they support Pierre's continued leadership. The issue of where he will run in a by-election to take a seat in the House is going to be an interesting question going forward. But I think he has the support of the party at large to go forward and try to win the next time around.
George, what would you say, in not so much as a New Democrat, but as a political strategist, should Pierre Poilievre stay? Because when you look at, again, the polling numbers, the party outperformed the leader. In fact, the leader seemed to be a distraction for many people and a reason why they did not vote Conservative.
Well, I think even more than that, he's also the reason people were turned off from the Conservatives, and many people across the province were. Not only did he underperform, but he also fed that same anger that we saw from Danielle Smith. I mean, that anger and that fight that people are feeling, rather than trying to find solutions, he kind of fed into that, right? Like Ottawa's broken, Canada's broken, and really drove those divisions and cut those divides more deeply. And I think that's actually a problem. So, as a strategist, for the Conservative Party, I'd probably say, like, I get why some people want to keep him, but I think we need to find a more moderate ground. And as someone who just cares about Canada, like, I think it's fine to have people on very different perspectives. I think we do well with that, but that anger, we need to be kind of trying to support those folks rather than feeding that anger. And I think Doug Ford's a really good example of that, actually. Like, I'm no fan, but this is someone who had a clear line: Donald Trump bad, Canada good. Pierre Poilievre took a long time to get there. And so I think that's the kind of thing we need to work on.
Yeah, I will also say I interviewed Doug Ford in the last days of the election. I did a fireside chat with him in Toronto, and he actually said, "I'm a proud progressive Conservative." He really hit that progressive tone. What do you make about Pierre Poilievre? If you were a Conservative, Ms. Liberal, should he stay for the party?
I see the case that can be made. He did do, historically very well on the popular vote and on seat count, and I think the Conservative Party is probably getting a little bit of leadership whiplash, going through quite a few in the last several years, so there may not be appetite to do another leadership again, but he is inherently unlikable. To many Canadians. I agree with a lot of what George said there. If he doesn't pivot that anger, if he doesn't change his tone, I think we'll be back here again in 3 years and have a historic 5th Liberal mandate.
She says hopefully to the skies. But listen, if the Conservatives have to debate their leader, we know that the NDP is going to need a new leader. Jagmeet Singh says he's going to depart once an interim leader is chosen by the caucus in Ottawa. But also, New Democrats need to confront the fact, George, that they have been losing support ever since Jack Layton and the Orange Wave. In fact, that vote is looking further and further in the rearview mirror right now. Except for the fact that when you look at provincial New Democrats in the West, they do much better than the federal party. Does the federal party need to change? Does it need to look to the West for examples?
Look, I mean, I think I take your point on kind of the trajectory we've had since 2011. So that for sure. This election in particular, very special set of circumstances. People very much believed it came down to Trump, right? And it was like, are you okay with Trump? Then you vote blue. If you are scared of Trump, then you vote red, because only Mark Carney became the issue. Only Mark Carney can really stand up to Donald Trump. And we had people like literally talking to our MPs, and I knocked on some doors. Love you guys, doing great work. I'm really sorry, I gotta vote Liberal this time. Don't worry, I'm still a member, right? Like literally saying those lines, not just kind of in theoretical terms. So like that was a huge challenge we had in this time. And also like there was just an extra push on strategic voting, quote unquote strategic voting, that led to this weird place where, people believed, even in places where they had an NDP MP, that somehow they'd vote Liberal to beat the Conservatives.
But does that not lead to some introspection about where the party is
for
and
sure.
where it needs
and we
to
need
be?
to do that. And you're right. And beyond even, like, we are government in British Columbia, official opposition in Alberta, Saskatchewan, government in Manitoba, official opposition in Ontario, official opposition in Nova Scotia. Like right across the country, provincially, we've been able to find our ground. And in fact, in a lot of those places, the Liberals have succumbed to that growth of the NDP, and the opposite happened federally this time around. So yeah, we do have to figure out how to rebuild and how to regain that support again, for sure.
Mm-hmm. What do you make about the future that the NDP has to contend with right now, Stevie?
I sympathize a little bit because I'm also done a lot of work with the Ontario Liberal Party, and I know how difficult it can be to rebuild when you've lost party status. It took how many? 3 elections before the OLP was able to regain party status. And I think now there's a path forward for real growth and change because, to be honest, frankly, because of funding and resources. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to move forward without those things. I think what that means for this election is we'll probably have a very stable minority government. That's not going to be. We're not going to be going to the polls again for a while.
Yeah, your quick response to that? What do you think?
Just quickly, I will say one of the big differences here, and like I'm not making excuses for anything. We lost badly, but somehow we also still have a balance of power. Like the Liberals, just like the last time, the Liberals can go to any of the 3 other parties for support, and the NDP is one of those. And so I think it's a different case possibly for official party status, given that we have a balance of power. There's like some significance there. And also I think there is still a relative way for the NDP to stay relevant, even with just 7 seats. Because when votes come along, and the Conservatives say go away, and I know the Bloc so far said they'll support, but who knows how long that'll last. the NDP will be an option. And so even with 7 seats, they play a significant role in this House of Commons.
Cole, what do you think of the future of the NDP?
Sure. I think during the election, Jagmeet Singh didn't have a particularly good performance. I thought before the election, the agreement with the Liberals hurt them. Then when the election became about Trump, tariffs, and the cost of living, Jagmeet was just kind of frozen out of that conversation. So I think going forward, the New Democrats will have a leadership race. They'll go through the regular process, but I do think they need to look to the Western Canadian versions of the NDP that have been very successful. Wab Kinew, Rachel Notley, David Eby. These are the parties that they need to look to make themselves competitive in future elections, and I hope they're successful in doing that.
Okay. Your Liberal cousin may have something else to say about that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But George, Stevie, Cole, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time today.
Thanks.
Thank you.